Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling today's hearing. I certainly want to welcome today's witnesses to the hearing on the Inspector General's May 16, 2011 report on the SEC leasing deal for the Constitution Center building located here in Southeast Washington. The shocking findings by the IG on a leasing agreement for more than $500 million paint an outrageous picture of an agency that was incompetent to engage in real estate transactions and consequently developed a culture that allowed bureaucrats to make major unsupported financial commitments on behalf of the agency using outright deceit and possibly fraud. The IG findings are so serious that they point towards possible criminal violations by federal employees in the course of official activities, leading to the execution of the leasing agreement. According to the IG, several SEC employees worked in concert to repeatedly subvert the direction provided by the SEC chairwoman on the placement of new employees, made false representations, and doctored documents to justify a sole source leasing agreement. SEC employees relied on the self-delusion that Congress would appropriate all the authorized funds under Dodd-Frank, the new regulatory reform legislation, although the notion that SEC would obtain an appropriation for a full authorization for new employees was historically inconsistent with SEC's budget and flies in the face of the simple fact and widespread knowledge that authorization of funding never has ensured full appropriation of those funds. More importantly, the notion that all the new employees would be housed at the SEC headquarters was found to be completely unsupported and at odds with the express direction by the SEC chair to the staff that most of the growth should be concentrated in regional offices. The abuse did not end there. Contrary to the General Services Administration standard of 230 square feet per person in an office, the SEC Office of Administrative Services, or OAS, provided an estimated need for 400 square feet per person, nearly double the GSA standard. This overly generous standard was later inflated by a factor of 49% for auxiliary staff, even though the 400 square feet per person actually was meant to accommodate the auxiliary staff. The IG concluded that this inflation by the SEC OAS, quote, employed a series of unfounded, egregiously flawed, and irresponsible projections to derive the purported need to lease 900,000 square feet, end quote. Even if the SEC had received all the authorized funds provided by Dodd-Frank, the SEC would have needed at most an additional 300,000 square feet, only a third of the 900,000 the agency eventually leased. Why then did the SEC lease 900,000 square feet? The answer provided by the IG is that a few SEC OAS officials had what he called grandiose plans to lease the upscale Constitution Center. Having set the target square footage, they worked backwards, using a, quote, deeply flawed and unsound analysis to justify the lease, according to the IG. To compound the damage, the $556 million lease agreement was conducted as the government never does, as a sole source contract that was completed in over 3 days, just over 3 days. Only after the contract was signed was a justification and approval for other than full and open competition prepared. And according to the IG, it was inadequate, not properly reviewed and backdated, and prepared well past the deadline, regulatory deadline for such contracts. The IG also has raised the serious question that this leasing agreement may have violated the Anti-Deficiency Act, which prohibits officers or employees of the government from committing the government to a payment of money before an appropriation is made authorized by law. Astonishingly, this transaction represents a pattern since the SEC was granted leasing authority in 1990. The agency has made repeated missteps from the build-to-suit lease for the SEC headquarters behind Union Station that led to $48 million in construction overages and the mishandling of lease transactions in San Francisco and New York, forming a leasing division only 19 years after receiving leasing authority. The SEC was granted its own leasing authority with the expectation that the authority would be, in quotes, exercised vigorously by the Commission to achieve cost savings and to increase the Commission's productivity and efficiency, end quote. Sadly, the opposite has been the case and calls into serious question the grant of leasing authority to the SEC or to any federal agency. This subcommittee has an obligation to taxpayers to understand the steps that led to the Constitution Center lease, to take corrective measures to ensure the SEC can no longer engage in leasing activities, and to ensure that appropriate action regarding the employees involved is taken. Notably, several employees implicated in this leasing transaction have refused the invitation of this subcommittee to testify, and at least one of the principal players named in the IG report still has oversight of the SEC leasing program. The SEC leadership is on notice that if there is retaliation against the employees that provided testimony to the SEC IG, we will respond immediately. I appreciate the testimony that has been prepared. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses. Mr. Chairman, I have served on this subcommittee for 20 years. I have seen mishaps by agencies of various kinds, some of them deliberate. I doubt that I or any other member of Congress has ever seen an abuse approaching this that was as determinedly done by the employees involved. I have therefore drafted a bill to revoke SEC's leasing authority. I recognize that the BRAC bill, which you and I are working on now, will in fact revoke the authority of agencies outside of the GSA to engage in such leasing. Agencies that may have expertise in the mission assigned to them by Congress, but certainly not in a very complicated, different area of enterprise, and that is real estate areas. I believe that taxpayers would not be content if we said, don't worry, we will get to this when the BRAC bill is done. It takes two houses. It takes going to the floor. I believe an immediate response by this committee is necessary, particularly since it has always been doubtful that agencies outside the GSA should have such authority. So I will be asking you, Mr. Chairman, to look at the bill I have drafted in the hope that you will co-sponsor that bill with me, and perhaps we can get that bill to the floor before this calendar year is over.